important notes about online learning. Download the slides and go through them along with the video or audio. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words. This is important for your own understanding. You still need to go through your manual and do the work points. You still need to explore further using additional reading or online investigation. For example, YouTube has some wonderful linguistic resources. While doing online learning, it becomes even more important that you do these things. You will need to manage your own time and take more responsibility for your own learning. Syntax, the structure of language. By the end of this lecture, I would like you to be able to distinguish language from general communication and briefly explain what syntax is and how it relates to linguistics. I'd like you to be able to name a few international syntacticians, which demonstrates that syntax is part of a larger global project, but through which we can articulate understandings of our local languages. You need to be able to differentiate the different levels of formal linguistic analysis and explain and provide simple demonstrations of hierarchy, discreteness, recursion, and compositionality. By the end of the lecture, I would like you to be able to describe language structure as a type of abstract scaffolding. What we exactly mean by this metaphor is going to become much clearer as the module progresses. So what's cool about syntax? Syntax is one of the oldest branches of formal linguistics, tracing heritage back to the Indian linguist and philosopher Panini about 400 years before the Common Era, and the Port Royal grammarians in around 1660. In its generative form, it's been going strong since at least 1957, with papers on hundreds of languages by thousands of people. It has directly or indirectly prompted the development of many other frameworks, for instance word grammar, HPSG, LFG, categorical grammar, etc. Syntax provides a simple set of rules to describe and explain all human languages. The theory is drawn from input from linguists all over the world and from languages from all over the world. Syntax is truly a global enterprise. By doing syntax, you are taking part in a global project to describe the languages of the world and explain both their interconnectedness, which means how they are similar, as well as their differentiation, which is how they are different. Linguists and syntacticians come from all over the world. The founder of modern syntax is arguably the American philosopher, political activist, and linguist Noam Chomsky. Other people that have contributed are Steven Pinker, Aditi Lahiri, Junko Ito, Artemis Alexiadou, Enoch Abo, Felix Ameka, and Tanya Reinhardt, to name just a few. So linguistics is the study of human language. But before we talk about language, let's clarify for ourselves what is communication. Communication is endemic in the animal world. Many species communicate. For instance, bees communicate non-verbally through a set of complex dances that are aligned to the angle of the sun with respect to some kind of pollen source. And when bees find a pollen source, they'll come back to the hive, perform this dance, which communicates a set of complex instructions to the bees so that they can go and find the pollen source. We know that whales, porpoises, and dolphins can communicate, and many of you might already have heard recordings of so-called whale song. Whales and porpoises use sounds for echolocation, for instance finding each other and finding food in the darkness of the sea. However, they will also seem to use these sounds for communication between groups. There's a documented instance of two pods of whales which were traveling many kilometers apart and which were coincidentally being monitored by two separate groups of marine biologists. At one point, one of the pods of whales began to sing their song, and many hundreds of kilometers away, the other pod of whales changed direction, and a few days later the two pods met together. This seems to strongly imply that whale song is a form of non-verbal communication. Non-verbal communication can also be visual. For instance, peacocks have a complex display of tail feathers which show that they are ready to mate. There are no words, there are no sentences, but nevertheless the meaning of the peacock tail seems very clear, at least to other peacocks. Human beings also communicate non-verbally. If you look at this picture, you will see a young man and two young women, and we can immediately see, even though there are no words in the picture itself, that they are favorably disposed to each other, that their body language indicates that they are relaxed, and friendly, and that they are perhaps interested in furthering their relationship. All this is done without words. So communication is any system of transferring information. It could be smoke signals, whale songs, bee dances, chatting, courtship dances, etc. What is important to note, though, is that language seems to be unique to human beings. There doesn't seem to be anything comparable in the animal world. So communication is the transfer of information by a medium, including language, but also including other things. It does not need to be systematic, and it uses general cognitive mechanisms such as association, relevance, contrast, inference, fuzzy logic schema, drives, visualization, and many more. The problem with this kind of model of communication is that it takes the code for granted. It doesn't tell us very much about what the code is. What are its rules? What defines the range of possible constructions in the code? We could ask ourselves, are the codes for human language infinitely variable? Are there similarities between the codes? What makes a good code? Are some codes better for communication than others? Are there similar codes in other species? How did the code evolve in the species? And perhaps most important of all, this kind of model of communication tells us about communication. It doesn't tell us something that's very specific to language. So enough about communication. What then is language? Language is a complex and specialized code. It is unique to human beings. Children seem to learn the language without any explicit teaching, and this contrasts quite sharply with other kinds of knowledge like mathematics or physics. For instance, if you put a young child into a Japanese home, it will acquire Japanese, even though it doesn't need to go to a Japanese school, and no one has to sit the child down and tell it exactly how to go about speaking the language. We all know that children seem to suck language out of thin air and learn it all by themselves. In fact, we know that when adults do attempt to correct children, often children seem to ignore that advice. If you were to compare this with mathematics, we get a very different picture. If you were to put a child into a home, how likely is it that the child acquires a complex understanding of trigonometry or geometry? Typically, for this kind of knowledge, we need to go to school. This suggests that language is innate. In other words, human beings have a hardwired disposition to learn and acquire language. We use language every moment of every day. We use it to communicate, flirt, save lives, write poetry, philosophize, joke, chat, shout, scream, whisper, and of course to earn money. Here are a few properties of human language. They can be divided into two types: functional properties and structural properties. Functional properties can tell us what we can do with language, while structural properties tell us about the language code and what it consists of. Functional properties include temporal displacement, the ability to lie and transmit culture. By temporal displacement, we mean that we can talk about things that are not in the here and now. We can talk about things that happened yesterday, we can talk about the future, and we can even talk about possible worlds that might not even exist. For instance, I could say something like, I'll do the dishes when pigs can fly. Now we all know that pigs cannot fly and will never fly, but we also know what the world would look like if pigs were to fly. We also have the ability to lie or tell untruths, and we also can use language to transmit culture and transmit learning. In fact, this is what we're doing right now in this video. These are all functional properties. They tell us what we can do with language, and there are probably an infinite number of these types of things. Language also has structural properties. These include discreteness and constituency, structure dependence, hierarchy and dominance, recursion and productivity. We will go through each of these in turn right now. Discreteness. Discreteness is the idea that we can take language and break it down into smaller bits and find that each of these bits are self-contained. Here's a sentence: all dogs are animals. But sentences can consist of constituents. We will talk about this in a future lecture. One of those constituents might be a noun phrase like all dogs. Constituents can also be broken down into smaller words. For instance, all dogs can be broken down into the words all and dogs. We can take the word dogs and break that down into morphemes. For instance, the root dog and the plural morpheme z. We can take those morphemes and break them down even further into phonemes. For instance, d, g, z, And we can take those phonemes and break them down into their constituent features. So, for instance, the Z phoneme is a voiced alveolar fricative. It would seem that language consists of discrete building blocks, which build up from features upwards into more complex structures. Discreteness then suggests that there is structure in language, or that there are chunks that make up natural units of linguistic analysis. Structure dependence. Now, it's not just enough to know the words of a sentence. There's also deeper structure that helps determine the meaning of a sentence. Let's give you a simple example. The cat nibbled the mouse. We all have an idea of what this might mean. There's a nibbling event. The mouse is being nibbled on and the cat is doing the nibbling. Now, intuitively, we know that there is some structure in this sentence because if we scramble up the words completely, the meaning disappears. The nibbled cat moused is clearly not a grammatical sentence. However, we can be a little bit more subtle about it. Let's take the sentence, the cat nibbled the mouse, and use the exact same words to create a different sentence. The mouse nibbled the cat. In this instance, it is the cat that is being nibbled on and the mouse that's doing the nibbling. But wait, we've used exactly the same words as the previous sentence. So how can it mean a completely different thing if we've used the same words and the words all have the same meaning? Well, the answer must be that it's not the words by themselves that are giving the meaning to the sentence, but rather the underlying structure that brings it all together. This is what this course is going to be about, looking at this kind of structure. This property is also known as compositionality. The meaning of an expression is a combination of the meanings of the individual words and features, as well as the relationships between them. These relationships are then created by structure. Now, what do we mean by structure? We will become a lot clearer about what this means in the rest of the course. For now, I want you to imagine it as a kind of scaffolding, like building scaffolding. Recursion. Recursion is the ability to put something inside the same type of thing. For instance, Russian dolls. You take one Russian doll and you open it, and inside there is inside there is another Russian doll. You open that one, and inside that one there is another, and another, and another. Another type of recursion you might experience when you go and buy clothes. If you stand in its changing room with mirrors on both sides, and you were to look into it, you would see a reflection of yourself in the other mirror, which is a reflection of yourself, which is a reflection of yourself, which is a reflection of yourself, and this goes on forever. When it comes to language, we can see recursion in a number of ways. For instance, we can put noun phrases inside other noun phrases. Let's start with the sentence, I saw Sandile. Now we can take the noun phrase Sandile and put it inside another noun phrase, I saw Sandile's mom. And we can take that chunk and put it inside another noun phrase, and it becomes, I saw Sandile's mom's cat. And we can take that bigger chunk and put it into another noun phrase, I saw Sandile's mom's cat's fish paste. And we could probably play this game for quite a while until we ran out of patience or imagination. In principle, if we had enough of both, we could play this game infinitely. Here's another kind of recursion, this time creating relative clauses. This is the cat. This is the cat that saw the dog. This is the cat that saw the dog that chased the mouse. This is the cat that saw the dog that chased the mouse that ate the cheese. And we could probably go on for quite a while. In each of these cases, we've taken an embedded clause and put it inside a noun phrase, creating a complex relative clause each time. Hierarchy. Hierarchy is the idea that some parts of a sentence seem to be more prominent than others. Informally speaking, they can make things happen in other constituents. Here are some examples. If you look at a sentence like, she didn't see any books on the table, there's a negation, didn't, and there's also a determiner or quantifier, the word any. And in this sentence, it kind of means some. So she didn't see any books on the table means that she didn't see some books on the table. If you were to compare that with the same similar sentence but without any negation, it becomes ungrammatical or at least quite odd semantically. She saw any books on the table. In this ungrammatical example, the word any doesn't seem to mean some, so the meaning seems to have changed. The generalization seems to be that the negation didn't conditions the presence of any in the sentence. Here's another example. A pronoun can bind an anaphor, but not the other way around. We can say she saw herself in the mirror. Herself is an anaphor, also called an oreflexive, and she is a pronoun. So she saw herself in the mirror is perfectly acceptable, but if we switch them around, you get the ungrammatical sentence, herself saw her in the mirror. This seems to suggest that one of these constituents, namely the pronoun she, is more prominent or somehow makes the anaphor happen, informally speaking. Another example happens with agreement. Agreement is a relationship between usually a subject and its predicate. So if you look at the sentence I have on the slide, she gets upset every time her boss walks into the room. The verb get obtains an S morpheme, gets, and that links to the pronoun she. Similarly, walk becomes walks, and that is linked to the noun phrase her boss. We know this is the case because if we were to change these noun phrases to plural, we'll see that the verb form changes. So get remains get when we have a plural pronoun like they, and walk remains walk without the S when we have a plural noun phrase, the pets. What this suggests is that the nature of the subject noun phrase conditions agreement. Agreement typically relates to person, number, and in some languages, the grammatical gender. There are at least two things that are important here. The first is that the subject determines the agreement on the verb, and not the other way around. So in one way, it seems that the subject is more structurally prominent than the verb. The other important thing to notice is that it is the subject that determines agreement on the verb, and not the object. This is evidence that the subject is hierarchically more prominent than the verb, and also that the subject is hierarchically more prominent than the object. So what does this tell us? These properties, namely recursion, hierarchy, agreement, constituency, etc., all tell us something important about language. Language is much, much more than just a way of communicating to achieve a functional objective, and it is more than just repeating things that we've heard before. If this were true, language would be finite, and we would run out of things to say. But language seems to be an abstract system, which uses abstract rules that allows us to create an infinite number of possible sentences. Noam Chomsky credits Wilhelm von Humboldt with the famous saying, "Language makes infinite use of finite means."